Welcome back, everybody, to our second session of the day. It's really my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Charne Lavery and Jauquelyne Kosgei, who are going to be talking to us about writing the ocean worlds, particularly focused on the Indian Ocean. Charne's coming to us from Pretoria, and I believe, Jackie, you are in Kenya. So one of the really wonderful things about our being plunged into a pandemic and becoming dependent on Zoom is that we at least get to engage with our colleagues living far away from us much more easily than we perhaps did in the past. So I'm very, very pleased that they've agreed to talk to us today. And I believe, Charne, you're going to kick us off.
Thanks. Can I just say next time in Kenya, we
Absolutely.
can all be there. That would be better.
No question.
Okay, great. I'll just share my screen. There you go. You can all see that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I know it's quite late in Australia, where the majority of you are based, and everyone is very tired at the real last end of the year. So thank you for being here. I just want to say that this Global Encounters project is a remarkably important and generative project, and it has been a great joy and privilege to connect with Lynette and some of the other team members over the last year or so, and to be even just aware of it has been fantastic. So for this session, I want to introduce some of the ideas of my supposed to be out 4 days ago, soon to be out at some point in the next few weeks, I guess, book that intersect with the conceptual frame of Global Encounters, and particularly that formulation of the Global Encounters project, that encounter from the other side of the beach. So the book concerns the way that global encounters are mapped in fiction in English, and so represents kind of one thin or narrow slice or vantage point on a very complex terrain. I do think there's something important about fiction and its synthetic capacities, bringing together a huge range of kind of sources and material, but nevertheless, it's just this kind of one view. The work of the book formed the basis for a much wider project in the oceanic humanities, which is how I came to be in touch with the Global Encounters project. And I do invite you to visit our website. Here's just an image of it, to get a sense of the kind of range and scope of projects that the wider project is undertaking. It is undergoing a little bit of a revamp, so that might be some glitches at the moment. One of our researchers, Jauquelyne Kosgei, is here today, and she is going to present on work that complements and fills in some of the gaps in the book, particularly a project that draws in oral history and Indigenous languages, which it really extends the picture I'm presenting of an Indian Ocean world. We also both going to talk a little bit about that kind of complementary work, but also in new directions in our research, kind of not yet completed research, ideas that we would love to discuss with you and to get feedback on. Both of us have shifted a little bit towards the ecological and the undersea as another kind of encounter. Okay, so the book is called Writing Ocean Worlds, and it centers on the Indian Ocean, which for centuries has facilitated travel among its distant shores, connecting African, South Asian, and Arab coastlines in what is widely thought to be the earliest form of globalization. These global encounters produced long-standing relations of South-South mobility, established well before European imperial exploration, and continuing, although in often submerged ways, into the present. So they constitute what is known as the Indian Ocean world. The book focuses on a strand of post-colonial fiction in English that centers itself in that world, rather than, for instance, the world of the post-colonial nation. retrieving its forgotten histories and fully imagining its diverse character and its capacities. The Indian Ocean in this fiction demonstrates a capacity in particular to shift conceptions of literary space away from land and nation and towards sea and world, a remapping that centralizes the ocean and the South. The book focuses on Amitav Ghosh, Abdulrazak Gurnah, who recently, our most recent Nobel Prize winner, to our very immense delight, Lindsey Collen from Mauritius, and colonial modernist precursor Joseph Conrad, whose oeuvres capture the geographical as well as literary scope of the Indian Ocean. They sort of cover the western, Ghosh, the eastern, Gurnah, an island midpoint, Collen, and an outsider's view in Conrad. The Indian Ocean in this work invokes a longue durée that reaches both before and beyond the time of European exploration, centralizing instead exploration by indigenous seafarers and alternative non-Eurocentric histories. It also shifts the imagined terrain of center and periphery further south and recasts these overlooked shores as neither static nor ahistorical, but as connected and central. So I wanted to start with some basics, which I think might be very familiar to this particular audience, but just in case they're not. The Indian Ocean is, in human historical terms, far older than the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans, and its shores more densely interconnected. Transoceanic exchange developed in the early centuries BCE and laid the foundations for an Indian Ocean network of trade and travel that was established at least 1,000 years before the Atlantic world. This can be explained by the ocean's unique geographic characteristics. The continental roof of Asia, as you can see in this image, heats up in summer, creating a vacuum, and cools down faster than the ocean in winter to drive winds back out over the sea, creating the monsoon, which blows northeast across the ocean half year and southwest the other half. It is this predictable and powerful monsoon system that permitted regular back and forth cross-ocean travel, even in relatively weak wooden craft, and which continues to affect shipping, although far less so in the age of steam and now oil. The long-term connectedness produced by the monsoon underlies what historians refer to as the Indian Ocean world, defined not simply by geography or environment, but also through the relationship and interaction of these with coastal, island, and maritime communities. The world terminology draws on Immanuel Wallerstein's definition of a world system, so called because, to quote, not because it encompasses the whole world, but because it is larger than any juridically defined political unit. Many historians argue that the term avoids some of the pitfalls of area studies categories and land centrism. Shugata Bose prefers the term interregional arena, which similarly shifts the emphasis from nation and area studies to wider political imaginaries. Gaurav Desai employs the Afrasian Sea as a way of counteracting the tendency to prioritize India and exclude Africa in Indian Ocean studies, while Kenyan novelist Yvonne Orr takes that even further in proposing the Swahili Seas should be the term. I rely on Indian Ocean world in the book because it presents a capacious view of the space, reaching from the Cape of Storms to the China Seas, one which is matched by the worlds to be found in the novels. Moreover, it highlights the world-making capacities of the novel itself. So this relies on a kind of a premise that novels make worlds. Readers share an intuitive sense that novels produce a vivid, impressionistic, memorable sense of place, both the sensory details of the nearby and the limits of the far away. As Ghosh writes, those of us who love novels often read them because of the eloquence with which they communicate a sense of place. This is captured by the phrase, the world of the novel. As Peng Che argues, a world cannot be directly seen or perceived by virtue of its sheer size. This. Worlds are necessarily imagined, and literature is one kind of world-making activity that enables us to imagine a world. Treating the Indian Ocean as an aesthetic, as well as geographic, political, and social space means being just as interested in the worldliness of the text as in their imaginative world-making capacities. This creative capacity is neither limited to novels nor unidirectional. Sharachari glosses geography as earth writing, geography, therefore as earth writing, ocean writing, and world writing. Inviting us to access the written as well as the lived archives of the Indian Ocean, which he also calls the People's Ocean or the Subaltern Sea. It's also being called the Ocean of the South and the Ocean of the Future. Chari reminds us that while texts are a symptom of space, space is also a symptom of writing. Recognizing that reflexivity means addressing not only the space-making power of art, but also in this case, the impingement of the particular geography and history of the Indian Ocean on the form of the novels. Ghosh writes about his interest in the Indian Ocean that I wanted to write about it because it was a challenge, because the whole terrain of the novel has historically been so much of exploring a place, creating a sense of place, a sense of rootedness, as in Turgenev, for instance, or George Eliot. It was a challenge to try and see how you could take the form outwards, explore these different sorts of connections. So what are the ways in which the form is taken outwards by the centrifugal forces of the Indian Ocean world? As Franco Moretti suggests, take a form, follow it from space to space, and study the reasons for its transformations. Following fiction then to the Indian Ocean, the book explores the relationship between the geopolitical and geographical formation of the Indian Ocean world and the representational or aesthetic worlds produced by literary texts. In Abdulrazak Gurnah, the Nobel Prize winner's first novel, Memory of Departure, which is very, very hard to find now, the young narrator notes that the seaside town he grew up in had been in existence for centuries before inland British established Nairobi was even thought of. So this is a Kenyan connection. As he says, we were trading with China before the railways that gave birth to this conceited works depot had ever been invented. A perspective located on a long populated coast relativizes the apparent progress symbolized by colonial capital, presenting instead various measures and markers of modernity. As Isabel Hofmeyr argues, the Indian Ocean can be thought of as the site par excellence of alternative modernities, powerful, particularly because they are, to quote, formations of modernity that have taken shape in an archive of deep and layered existing social and intellectual traditions. The Dao cultures, to quote a classic historical text of the region, that persist around its coastline constitute their own kind of globalized modernity, neither better nor worse, but more various, more diverse, and variously imagined by the novels considered here. This can be thought of as the fictional version of Dipesh Chakravarty's provincializing Europe, or rather deprovincializing the Indian Ocean as a kind of southern dispersed oceanic center, shifting the axes of time as well as space. So what's the point of all this? So in an interview, the same novelist, Yvonne Orr, I don't know why I'm saying that weirdly, recounts her experience working at the Zanzibar International Film Festival, also known as the Festival of Dao Countries. She says, to quote, "It did quite a mind job on me," she says, expanding my idea of where Africa begins and ends, beyond the terrestrial, finding that so much of Africa lies hidden in the sea. And the narrative of that seems to have been lost in our post-independence, post-colonial imagination. Her description of that expanding, expansive effect describes the impact of Indian Ocean fiction too, whether expanding the idea of Africa, as it is very important to me, India or Mauritius, or ideas of who we are and where we belong. If Orr laments the loss of a wider oceanic world in the post-colonial imagination, the same is true of post-colonial literature. The post-colonial novel in English has long been bound up with a European mapping of the world, exemplified by Rushdie's Midnight's Children or Achebe's Things Fall Apart, so that imposed national borders form the imagined space of the novel, and places peripheral to Europe are consigned to lie outside of history. The novels which appear in the book invoke a different set of borders, producing a map determined rather by the sea, with the complicating and enlarging effect that has on a sense of place in the world. So there are two important senses in which the book provides a narrow slice of a complicated and what Isabel Hofmeyr also calls a complicating sea. One is the limitation of language and genre, and the other is the focus on the socio-political rather than the environmental ocean. We have a cameo by a very nervous Whippet. So I wanted to focus on that environmental ocean by also pointing to this map of the Indian Ocean seabed, which is a much more populated map of the ocean than a classic kind of blank blue space. So the first limitation of language and genre is going to be addressed by Jackie, who will speak just now. And the second is attempting to be addressed by a newer research project of mine that I will just talk about now for ease of not changing PowerPoint too often. So, as I said, there's one sense in which the ocean is not central to the novels foregrounded in this book, and therefore to its readings. For the most part, the Indian Ocean in this fiction is figured as a socio-political space, a set of networks connecting across what we now know as the global south. But the ocean itself is largely overlooked as a material, elemental, and physical environment. Sorry, Ali, come here. Oh dear, sorry, there's a big storm coming. This becomes increasingly important as Indian Ocean studies comes to grips with climate change, and particularly changes in the monsoon climatic system, which has for so long determined the unity of the region. There's quite a lot of research showing that the monsoon is changing in important and unpredictable ways. So my new project tries to link Indian Ocean networks at the surface to its underlying depths, providing a cultural history of the submarine from the perspective of a southern sea. In a time of changing oceanic worlds, attentiveness to cultural history allows for centering of questions of value alongside questions of empirical fact. So these include cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic values of deep and southern oceans, which draw on scientific knowledge, but also represent different ways of knowing. This is particularly important in a region where technology for prediction, modeling, and exploration is least accessible because it's very expensive, submarine exploration, and where, for instance, indigenous knowledge systems have long been overlooked. At the same time, studies of oceanic cultural forms are largely inattentive to the ocean itself, treating the sea as a formless void over which trans and post-colonial networks connect. The idea here is to spotlight the sea itself by acknowledging its internal diversity on a vertical scale as well, setting as a structuring principle the ocean's 5 vertical layers in their ecological and material specificity. The sunlight zone, the midnight zone, the abyss, the twilight zone, the abyss, and the trenches. I'm just gonna have to put this dog on my lap. Come on. Sorry, now we have to work like this.
Charne, it's quite normal for us to be interrupted by dogs, and particularly even a whippet.
Okay, well, I'm nearly finished. Sunlight in the ocean penetrates to a depth of 200 meters, which is also close to the maximum recorded depths to which humans have been able to free dive, depending on definitions. This sunlight zone is the site of almost all human encounters with the submarine: diving, fishing, swimming, sounding. You can see my interest in the former presentation. The first chapter draws on, the first proposed chapter of this new book draws on Indian Ocean histories of pearl diving. So we're interested in the third session today, narratives of abalone poaching, circulations of cowrie shells across water and land, slave histories of the Indian Ocean in relation to its shipwrecks, and marine biologist characters in post-colonial fiction and film, of which there are weirdly many. The twilight zone ekes out the rest of the sunlight to 1,000 meters down and houses the largest migration on Earth of plankton moving vertically up and down the water column as the sun rises and falls. The Twilight chapter considers deep sea fishing around Indian Ocean seamounts, a range of artists whose work depicts Indian Ocean currents and creatures, and various myths of sunken continents in the region in relation to oceanic geology. The midnight zone is entirely dark and hugely pressurized, extending until the ocean's average depth of 4,000 meters, and until very recently thought to be lifeless. The third chapter will focus on discoveries in vent ecology on the Southwest Indian Ocean ridge in relation to the swiftly approaching prospect of deep sea mining, mediations of chemosynthetic life in documentary and news media, and poetic engagements with pelagic drift. The abyss is the region of the seafloor, its layers of sedimental ooze and contiguous near frozen waters. It is largely unmapped, yet overlain with fiber optic cables. It plays a crucial role in sequestering carbon and produces a vision of what Lindsey calls a folded ocean. This chapter considers the political ambivalence of seabed mapping projects, histories and artwork of Indian Ocean telegraphy, and imaginaries of a drained ocean. Below 6,000 meters, and up to around 11,000 meters, is the part of the ocean visited by fewer people than have walked on the moon. The Hadal Zone, with its deep water plains, deep troughs, and deeper trenches. This final chapter describes the deepest ocean as a frontier of exploration, 20,000 feet below the surface, as a source of tsunamis, an analog of outer space, and as represented in indigenous cosmologies. Okay, I will hand over to Jackie and go and find a Xanax for the scared dog.
Okay, thank you very much, Charne, for sharing with us about your soon to come out book and also your future project that we look forward to. So in my primary research, I studied the Indian Ocean using indigenous knowledges of the sea that Kenyan coastal people possess. So my study is focused more on the Kenyan coast and a little across the East African coast. And my research places shorefolk and seafarers at the center of oceanic studies. And from interviews that I have with these people, I come into contact with embodied, experiential, and intuitive knowledges of the sea that are carried in local sources of knowledge. And with these local-centered knowledges, my work shifts analysis of the sea from surface to depth and imagines a map of the sea that is local, intimate, and personal. Part of the texts I record and work with are oral histories that narrate histories of contact between Kenyan coastal communities and merchants, missionaries, and imperialists who came to the East African coast via the Indian Ocean, mostly from Arabia and Europe. And so some of these stories are stories that are hidden in the sea, yet to be excavated and more or less unwritten. And today I am sharing one oral history of a famous monument on the Kenyan coast, which is Fort Jesus in Mombasa. And this monument is one of 3 garrisoned forts that the Portuguese built on the East African coast in the 16th century. The other 2 being, as shows here in my PowerPoint, Fort St. James in Kilwa and St. Gaetano Fort in Sofala. In written historical record, the most detailed book being Fort Jesus and the Portuguese in Mombasa by Boxer and Diazevedo. Fort Jesus was built in 1593. This fort was central to the control of the East African coast, and whoever controlled it had control of the region, which is why there was a great siege of Fort Jesus between Omani Arabs and the Portuguese in 1696 to 1698. The fort exchanged hands between foreign parties about a dozen times. And in 1693, when Kenya became independent, the fort was made a national monument. And in 2011, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site. So oral history complicates this existing and widely circulated history of Fort Jesus. In 2018, I interviewed Mzee Suleiman Nyembwe, an 82 years old orator with whom I recorded a previously undocumented history of Fort Jesus. And this history, in this history, Mzee Nyembwe insists that Fort Jesus was originally called Ngomeni. And he recounts that on the shores of the Indian Ocean on the island of Mombasa was once a big stone with a cave in it. And one of the Digo clans, the Achinakulo, had made a home out of it. The cave was a haven to the Achinakulo because it protected from wild animals and rain. The Digo named this cave Ngome and the place Ngomeni, which means a place where there's a house carved out of a rock. A part of Ngomeni was a kaya, which is a shrine where the Mijikenda community used to pray. When the Portuguese arrived in Mombasa, they saw Ngomeni and liked it because, as Mzee Nyembwe says, if you go there, you will like it. You will admire it and you will be pleased because the place is just so nice. They had come with plans, the Portuguese had come with plans of constructing a fort on the Kenyan coast and had brought with them Duruma men from Tanzania who had architectural skills. But after seeing Ngomeni, they decided that they were going to make a fort out of it and evicted their Chinakulo clan. And with the forced labor of the local people, they converted Ngomeni to a big fort, which they named Fort Jesus. The oral history continues to assert that the Portuguese were powerful and had weapons and could order people around. They were also very cruel, and their cruelty caused people from the Kenyan coast to hold a large meeting in which they decided to invite the Arabs who they wished could help them evict the Portuguese. And that's when the war ensued, and the Mijikenda and other local people supported the Arabs in fighting the Portuguese. And because of these united efforts, the Portuguese were easily defeated, and the few who survived had nowhere to go to but the sea from which they came from. And so they got into ships and sailed away. After this, the Nyaturu or the Duruma men were left behind, and having nowhere to go, they went into villages around Ngomeni where they were welcomed and offered women to marry, and they stay on the Kenyan coast to date. After defeating the Portuguese, the Arabs occupied Ngomeni until when the British came. And the oral history narrates that another war took place and the British won. And this oral history concludes by mentioning that the British then occupied Ngomeni until when they handed it over to the Kenyan government when Kenya got its independence. So I ask what interventions this oral history makes. And I find that this local oral history, which for centuries has been preserved and disseminated in Kidigo, the local language, and was narrated to me in Kiswahili, the dominant language on the Kenyan coast, destabilizes the privileged position English has occupied in narrating the history of Fort Jesus and of the Kenyan coast at large. Since the place of written history is already clear and this knowledge is widely available, here is discussed some of the ways in which oral history raises questions and introduces ideas that expand this existing knowledge. So to begin with, this version introduces the Duruma, the Mijikenda, and other local people and positions them centrally in the history of Fort Jesus. For centuries, the most upheld fact about the construction of Fort Jesus has been its being designed by the Italian architect Joao Battista Cairato, with little else mentioned about other groups of people. This account also calls attention to alternative claims on the origins of the fort. Whereas available history contends that Fort Jesus came into being in 1593 when construction works began, this local history argues that Fort Jesus was always there as Ngomeni. In addition, is a new detail about the role of the Duruma in the construction of the fort. Their role is emphasized from the start, as Mzee Nyembwe, daring to place the Portuguese in a secondary position, says, and I quote the translation of his Kiswahili speech, but the Portuguese were not alone. I'm sorry, I lost my notes. But the Portuguese had with them the Duruma from those sides of Lindi in Tanzania. They were the architects and are the ones who renovated Ngomeni. So this is opposed to written history, which foregrounds the role of Battista, the architect, and highlights the participation of other groups of people. Consequently, this oral history diminishes the credit that has always been given to the Portuguese for their selection of the arguably perfect location for Fort Jesus. And most importantly, this oral account gives a landed history of Fort Jesus, which is new because the most popular history of this fort has been predominantly seaward. Much of the action in the Great Siege of Fort Jesus, for example, has dwelt a lot on describing the arrival of ships bearing soldiers, be they Omani or Portuguese, with little mention of what happens on land. There has been a picture of a fort that stands on the Kenyan coast, but which has always appeared as being more connected to Lisbon, Goa, and Muscat, and little connection to Mombasa itself. So in official history, Fort Jesus looks like a place, a part of the outside world that is wandering away from home, so that people are always described as coming to visit it, occupy it, protect it, fight for it, and so on. But in this oral history, the fort is reclaimed by people belonging to the Kenyan coast. With this image, one sees an attempt by the Mijikenda to proclaim themselves at home, both on land and at sea. And with this landed history, the local people declared that they owned Fort Jesus before anyone else did. And contrary to the fort relationship that subsequent occupants had with the fort, here we see Fort Jesus as a house one can walk into and not as a fort to be conquered. So what the Portuguese did in suppressing and setting aside this history and implanting the one that is known widely now is that they try to suppress or completely erase some aspects of Mijikenda ways of life, and in their place planted their own narratives, which because of the power they held, shaped official history. I have already pointed out that the Digo lost their home and with it their shrine. In this history, spiritual interference seems to be the most conspicuous form of disruption that the Portuguese caused. And there are two peculiar details in support of this, one being the shape of Fort Jesus, and here it is shown on the slide, and the other one is its name, Fort Jesus. So the fort is shaped in the figure of a human body with outstretched arms, and coupled with the name, the shape that we see here calls to mind the figure of Jesus on the cross, a symbolic interpretation of the cruciform plan. And one wonders, therefore, if through this, Europeans are not trying to demonstrate to Mombasa how Jesus died for them. And this falls in line with Europe's colonial mission, in which Europeans sought to bring light to the dark continent, which is Africa. So by renaming Ngomeni to Fort Jesus, the Portuguese did not just destroy Mijikenda's spiritual life, but they also sought to plant their religion, Christianity, as a replacement. But there's a way in which the Mijikenda and other local communities on the Kenyan coast tried to resist this form of erasure. And I see this as evidenced in the insistence on the name Ngomeni. Mzenyemwe and other people that I interacted with dispute the name Ngomeni. And from the beginning of my interview with Mzenyemwe, he tried to put the Portuguese in a secondary position by insisting that Fort Jesus is not the name, that's an English name, but the original name is Ngomeni, and that is where one of the Digo clans used to live. Those are the inhabitants of Ngomeni, he said. And throughout the narrative, he kept using the name Ngomeni, and by the end of our recording, I was also referring to Fort Jesus as Ngomeni. And this insistence, therefore, allows the Digo and the Mijikenda community at large to reclaim Fort Jesus as once belonging to them. It's a way of ensuring that colonial erasures do not wash away this indigenous history. And from this history and others that I've come in touch with in the process of my work, I find that indigenous knowledge can be the lens through which we visualize pre-colonial societies, especially on the Kenyan coast and other coasts, which we know have longer histories of contact than hinterland communities do. And consequently, by following by using localized forms of knowledge, we get a platform through which indigenous communities are granted legitimacy as subjects of history. And through acts of refusal to be confined to narrow, exclusionary historical perspectives, communities reclaim their place in histories from which they have been excluded. And we can give them voice by exploring local oral knowledges that they possess. And thus, historical accounts preserved and told in local languages transform otherwise marginal subjects of history to central figures and actors. In the end, we learn that there are no limits to historical facts and that perhaps there are as many archives as there are languages, and that we should explore all of them, more so across and along our coasts. Thank you very much.
Jackie, do you want to give us a sense of your future interests?
Okay, thank you. So the oral history I shared is quite localized, and it's narrowed to my engagements with oral histories of Kenyan coastal communities. But my other research mostly centers on using local experiences that divers and fishermen have on the Kenyan coast with how they engage with the ocean. So most of my other research that I'm working on is just an attempt to move to continue to move analysis of the sea from surface to depth, much of what Charne is working on in her next book. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Absolutely fascinating. So many synergies and a lot of connections with work that's been going on in Australia as well. I don't know if you're aware of the work that Emma Lee, she's a Trollope Palawa woman who works at the Swinburne University, but she works on, and I can easily, Charne, I can put you in contact if you like, but she works on, particularly on the sustainability of fishing and particularly in the Bass Straits, but she also writes beautifully about, you know, her imagining the walking across the seabed. And she has these kind of wonderful kind of moments where she begins to think about the relationship between those who live on the land and literally the land under the sea. So it's some fantastic stuff there. Does anybody have any questions or comments, please?
I'd love you to send me that, please, Lynette.
I'll do that. I made a note.
I'd just like to say thanks to both of you, Charne and Jackie. And Jackie, I just thought it was really powerful. I mean, I don't really have a question, but the continuity of occupation of the site and the way that was enacted by the community's use of the traditional name of nominee. I can't read my own writing, sorry. But I just think it's really powerful. There, as an assertion of sovereignty, and I wondered, because it was, you know, one of these, a location where there were some different layers of occupation by external, sort of colonizers, but the place has retained the name in English of Fort Jesus. Was it changed? I assume it was changed when it was conquered by Arab sort of forces. And does that name still have currency? Or yeah, I'm just wondering around the idea of naming and sovereignty and power, and what happens when a place is renamed. Yeah.
Would you like to answer that, Jackie?
Okay, thank you very much. Currently, Fort Jesus is the official name of this fort, and Ngomeni does not exist in the public domain except in Kenyan coastal communities. And I think it's been 400 years since the fort was, quote unquote, constructed and named or renamed to Fort Jesus from Ngomeni. And I think this long history of insistence of the name Ngomeni is that tireless act of trying to constantly remind every one of us that as much as we call this place Fort Jesus, it is not so, it is Ngomeni. So yes, in the public domain, it's called Fort Jesus. Rarely is it called Ngomeni, except among the local people, which shows and tells us that local histories and the experiences of local people continue to be set aside in the dominant knowledge around this and other monuments on the Kenyan coast.
We have a comment here, and indeed I think a question from Campbell McKnight saying, "Thank you, Jackie, for such an interesting presentation. The shape of Fort Jesus reflects the theories of fortification in the 16th and 17th century. The comparable one I know best is in Makassar and dates to the late 17th century. Perhaps there are links across the ocean in similar forts. The one in Makassar is usually described as a turtle rather than a human." This is precisely the sort of encounter and thoughts about, global interactions that we're excited about and hoping that might spark off. So did you have a comment on that, Jackie?
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this observation. Yes, there's a similarity in which these forts were created and named along coasts, not just on the Indian Ocean, but also on the Atlantic front. In West Africa, for example, in the West African, the Cape Coast in Ghana, the same thing happened, where a sanctuary that had a local shrine was converted to one of the famous forts on the region. So yes, there are trends and similarities across.
That's very exciting, from my perspective, very exciting avenue for us to start thinking about some of these potential connections and ways that we might detect them. Rosalie has her hand up. Rosalie Trioli.
Yes, I just love the synergies in this interdisciplinary project and the back and forth between history, geography, English, art. I'm just loving all these interconnections. But when I saw the map of the Pacific, the Indian Ocean shown as such a vast blue space, I really thought how the archipelago leads us to look up through Asia and across the Middle East into Europe, and not so much across the great expanse of the Indian Oceans. And I was trying to think, really, it's only the boab tree, I think, that has drifted in great numbers from Africa, unless there's any other geography or biology someone can share. But I love too, Charne, your structuring of your book, that it's a vertical layering. I think that's really different and a different way of looking at the Indian Ocean and bringing in the English dimension as well. More a comment.
No, I would love to respond. Yeah.
Please, Charne.
We call them baobab trees, very similarly, and a few people are actually working on these circulations in the Indian Ocean of plants, various plants, and to Madagascar, some to Indonesia, some all the way to Australia. But I remember thinking a long time ago, I saw there was a sort of obscure newspaper article about the first great white shark that had been recorded by, had a tracker on and recorded swimming from Cape Town to Australia. And for some reason they'd named the shark Nicole. So I just remember thinking, Nicole the shark has swum all that way across. And now there's actually quite a lot of, I guess, record of species connection between along this route, this kind of latitudinal connection, that vast expanse. It's something I'm working on as well, is to think through a lot of Indian Ocean histories and even imaginative geographies really focus on the northern hemispheric part of the Indian Ocean, which is actually quite a small section of that ocean. And it's because it's connected by the monsoon, is the part that's kind of a sort of semi-Mediterranean world-ish, closer to that kind of interconnectedness. And that's linking Egypt, India, a little bit of Southeast Asia, but that's the part that most of the histories focus on. And I am increasingly interested and have spoken to Lynette a bit about this, about working on how to think through a much more southern hemispheric Indian Ocean connectedness, which requires taking into account that vast blank space of ocean, and very inhospitable section of ocean. You know, it's very wild, barely populated section, but it does then link Southern Africa and Australia, as well as the subantarctic islands in between. So a network on histories of sealing and whaling come into play there, but also the fact that is the connecting current. So instead of seeing the ocean just as this blank space, to see it as a very lively, multi-species, but also oceanographically complicated region with currents that are very important for things like the northern monsoon. So that Southern Indian Ocean imaginary, it also links to, I think you only mentioned other papers that I've worked on have been about an Antarctic view of the world, a penguin's view of the world focused on Antarctica. But I think that Southern Indian Ocean region really focused on other kinds of connectivity other than monsoon winds. So current-based, the southerlies, it's a little bit more post-human imaginary, but not entirely in important ways.
Sorry about that. My internet suddenly decided it wasn't going to cooperate with me. So I was just in the midst of saying that the evidence that we have at the moment, Charne, is that the boab and the baobab actually separated about 6,000 years ago, and not, and they've almost, it's highly unlikely, it's regarded as highly unlikely that they floated across the ocean, primarily because they actually, all experiments indicate that they wouldn't last that long in the water. They will rot, and for them to have arrived here and be, sort of still viable, then it indicates that they arrived here through some other means, which we don't know what those means are, but it is one of the elements that we're really interested in this project, thinking about the ways in which plants might tell some of the stories of interactions, and it's very important, obviously. The other really interesting thing, Charne.
Sorry, by this question of the baobab, I just learned about, actually in planning a trip, about what's called the baobab corridor in a region quite close to mine, and it links to, I guess, some of what Jackie's also saying about landed versus oceanic histories. And there is a tendency to turn to the ocean and forget kind of interior hinterland, and therefore kind of an African involvement in these regions, to see it as like, okay, well, Indian Ocean exploration, everything's really Arab or Arab African, and not as linked. But there's a baobab corridor from the coast inland to where the gold mines and the trading empires were based. So perhaps there are interesting notes about how baobabs and other forms of plant matter indicate trading routes across the ocean, but also from the coastline into the interior, and so connecting, that no part of this region is ahistorical.
One of the other connections, which is rather intriguing to say the least, is a couple of what they call elephant, well, you would know this better than me, but elephant bird eggs. They come from, they've been found, 2 of them have been from the coast of Western Australia. Certainly did float across the ocean, so quite remarkable. And David's just reminding us that giant tortoises were dispersed across the Indian Ocean as well. And he's put a link there to a really fantastic article, which I highly recommend. So, okay, apologies for having dropped out there. So does anyone have any other comments? Or, I mean, that's just such lovely stuff. One of the, in the absence of any comments, one of the things that we're particularly interested in, Jackie and indeed Charne, are the fact that a number of Kilwa coins have been found in Australia, in Northern Australia. These are normally attributed to some connection through the VOC or potentially Macussons. But one of the things we're really hoping to do is to, generally speaking, these tend to be dismissed as a sort of, oh, it's an odd isolated find and it's not important. we think that if we were to synthesize all of these odd isolated finds, we might find if not a pattern, at least something slightly more meaningful than, they just, we don't know what they are, or, worse, they came from the Phoenicians, which we also get here in Australia, the Chinese, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, they're all supposed to have come to Australia at some point or other. So, we put those to one side, and we think the Kilwa coins are something that are worthy of us studying in a little bit more detail. And indeed, we do hope to get to Kenya and to Tanzania at some point, if this pandemic ever lifts.
Annette, there was one question I was going to raise, but my
Please,
spelling
Campbell.
got the better of me. The Malagasy people from perhaps from central Borneo getting to Madagascar is a sort of a spectacular Indian Ocean link.
Absolutely.
And it's also more southerly. I mean, we don't know where they went, but it's potentially a bit more southerly than the Arabs.
And you're absolutely right, Campbell, and that language connection really does raise all sorts of important and interesting questions for us. And I think Australia's been a little remiss in its connections to the Indian Ocean. We've not looked at it as closely as we perhaps could have. There's also some nice discussions, some Aboriginal women from Tasmania who travelled across from Australia. So they came from Tasmania and then they went up to Sydney and then across the Great Australian Bight and across the Indian Ocean to the Ile-de-France and then onto the Kerguelen Islands, where they spent some time sealing and then managed to negotiate themselves, their children and their dogs back to Australia after some time spent on the coast there. So it's quite a remarkable story.
I've actually have a postdoctoral fellow, Adrian van Eden-Wharton, working on histories of Zulu and other East African whalers involved in whaling projects from off the coast of East Africa, basically kind of jumping off from that insight about Indigenous whalers. It's, I think these alternative histories of, exploration over vast distances really push back against the notion of an only newly globalized world or only Western globalized world.
Yes. Well, in fact, whaling vessels are the real polyglot crews, aren't they? Leonie, you were going to ask something.
I was just going to make the point also that with Western Australia, for especially early in its colonial history, it was faster to go to the Cape Colony across to Africa than it was to go to New South Wales, to the Australian-based colonial headquarters. So there was across the Indian Ocean, that was a much faster thoroughfare for from in the very early days anyway, and because of the like you were saying, Charne, with the currents, the roaring 40s as we know them, made shipping across the bottom of the Indian Ocean extremely fast, once ships got into that that fast lane. So yeah, those connections are there, especially very early on through naval routes. So it's a very interesting area for exploration. Yeah.
It sort of brings us back to that idea, which we've almost every session has touched on at some point, and that is that the sea is not the impediment that we landlubbers might think it is. It's quite the reverse. It becomes, as we were saying, we become an island, a sea of islands, rather than islands in the sea. And I think that's a very powerful way for us to start remembering and thinking about and thinking through oceanic studies. One of the reasons I love the Oceanic Humanities site and WISER that you showed earlier, Charne, and I'm looking forward to the revamped website. That'll be great. It's fantastic connections, because it does all of that. It looks at deep sea. It thinks about the humanities, the literature, the poetry, but as well as the history and the people, the anthropology. It's a fantastic using the sea in a sense as the medium.
I've been thinking about the even just across the sessions in today, you know, one of the ways to think about it is as an Indian Ocean session, and another way to think about it is as this kind of interdisciplinary marine biological session across various species. I just think of all of the different fish we saw in that first session, the oysters and pearls we're going to look at in the next session, the coral that is used partly to build the fort in Jackie's presentation, and then, you know, the various nickel, the sharks, etc., that the baobabs, the tortoises, that, you know, there's even a mention of, in a different context, the Greenland shark, which might be the oldest lived creature. So just these, the penguin, you know, that there actually are a range of almost cross-species languages that need to be learned in order to work in this area. Yeah,
absolutely. There's so much to do. We all need about 5 lifetimes, but it's incredibly exciting. I thought I'd just do a little shameless plug for one of our affiliates and our colleagues who have done these marvellous shipwrecks of the Roaring Forties. And Charne, if you have any difficulty finding that, I'm very happy to make sure that you get a copy, because it's a really, really fantastic book. This is put together by Alistair Patterson and Jeremy Green, and it came out of a big project that they had on the Roaring Forties. In fact, the shipwrecks, and it seems like a perfectly timed moment that we're about to go over to see the shipwreck gallery with Corriley. But just thought that might be a useful thing, because there is something actually absolutely profound in the, you know, not just people bumping into the coast of Western Australia unexpectedly and unplanned, but there is some fabulous work that's been done in that already, that area.